What if the face you picture when you hear Beethoven is wrong? Not misunderstood, not incomplete. Wrong. You were taught Beethoven as a pale European genius, isolated, almost mythical, a man who emerged from nowhere and changed music forever. But that image wasn't inherited from his lifetime. It was manufactured after his death. And once you look at the original records, the portraits, the descriptions, the social context, the story cracks immediately. Let's get straight to it. During Beethoven's lifetime, people didn't describe him as white in the modern sense. They described him as dark. Dark complexion, dark features, broad nose, thick lips, coarse hair. These aren't insults or exaggerations. They are consistent descriptors repeated by contemporaries who knew him personally. One of the most common labels used for Beethoven in Vienna was the Moor. That wasn't poetic. It wasn't metaphorical. It was racial. In 18th century Europe, Moor had a very specific meaning. It referred to people of African or Afro-Mediterranean descent, not fictional, not symbolic. Real people who existed across Spain, North Africa, and Europe for centuries, and Beethoven was repeatedly associated with them. Now ask yourself a simple question. Why would European aristocrats casually call their greatest composer the Moor if he looked like everyone else? They wouldn't, and it didn't stop there. Beethoven himself was hyper-aware of race. He lived in a rigidly stratified society obsessed with bloodlines and appearance, and yet, despite his unmatched talent, he was never fully accepted by the elite circles that benefited from his music. He was tolerated, used, but never embraced. That matters, because Europe has a long history of absorbing brilliance while distancing itself from the bodies that produced it. Let's talk about the portraits. Most people have only seen one Beethoven, the stern, pale, romanticized version painted decades after his death. But earlier portraits, especially those created during or close to his lifetime, tell a different story. Darker skin tone, wider facial structure, features that were later softened, narrowed, and Europeanized. This wasn't accidental. After Beethoven died, his image became valuable. Not just culturally, but politically. He was elevated as a symbol of European genius, and symbols get edited. You don't just rewrite books, you rewrite faces. Now let's talk lineage. Beethoven's family background is deliberately vague in mainstream education. We're told just enough to feel satisfied, but not enough to ask questions. His ancestry traces through regions of Europe that had heavy Moorish presence for hundreds of years. The Low Countries, the Rhineland, Spain's cultural spillover. These areas were not racially isolated. Europe wasn't white in the way it later pretended to be. Moors lived, ruled, married, and integrated across Europe long before Beethoven was born. They weren't visitors. They were part of the population. By the 18th century, their descendants didn't always announce themselves, but they were still there. So when contemporaries described Beethoven as dark, they weren't guessing, they were seeing. And this is where the tension begins, because Europe in Beethoven's era was entering a new phase. Colonial expansion, racial hierarchy, pseudoscience. Whiteness was being formalized, not just socially, but ideologically. Genius was being racialized, and Beethoven didn't fit cleanly. He was too brilliant to discard, too valuable to deny, but too inconvenient to fully acknowledge as he was. So the compromise was simple. Keep the music, edit the man. This is not unique to Beethoven, it's a pattern. When African or African-descended figures produce world-changing work inside European systems, the work is preserved while the identity is blurred, minimized, or rebranded. And the rebranding always happens after death, when the person can no longer object. Here's another uncomfortable fact. Beethoven showed deep admiration for African figures. He openly praised black generals. He condemned racial oppression. He aligned himself with revolutionary ideas that terrified Europe's ruling class. This wasn't abstract empathy. It was personal. People recognized themselves in the struggles of others. Now pause and think. Why is the idea Beethoven was black treated as outrageous, while the idea that Europe single-handedly produced all genius is treated as normal? That reaction alone should make you suspicious, because history doesn't react that way to lies. It reacts that way to threats. If Beethoven doesn't belong exclusively to whiteness, then whiteness loses one of its most powerful cultural weapons. If the greatest composer in Western music history wasn't racially what we were taught, then the entire story of European superiority starts wobbling. And that's why this topic is so aggressively policed. Not debated, policed. You're allowed to praise Beethoven, you're allowed to study him, but the moment you question the image, the door slams shut. That tells you everything. We're not claiming mythology, we're following evidence, descriptions, portraits, context, behavior, erasure patterns. And when you line them up, the sanitized version of Beethoven collapses. This isn't about stealing anyone's hero, it's about returning a human being to reality. Because Beethoven was not born as a symbol, he was turned into one. And in the next chunk, we're going to do something even more uncomfortable. We're going to examine why Europe needed Beethoven to be white, how racial science reshaped his legacy, and how textbooks quietly replaced a man with a myth. Once you see that process, you'll never look at classical history the same way again. Let's stop dancing around it and go straight to motive. Europe didn't whiten Beethoven by accident. They did it because they had to. By the early 1800s, Europe was rewriting the rules of power, not just through land and guns, but through culture, art, science, music. Genius itself was being rebranded as a racial asset, and once genius became racialized, every major cultural pillar had to fit the narrative. Beethoven was a problem, not musically, politically, because the man didn't behave like the image they later sold. He rejected aristocratic obedience. He refused to bow. He demanded respect, not permission. He walked into elite rooms like he belonged there, even when they didn't want him to. And that posture wasn't normal for someone of lower status in Europe at the time. It terrified them. This was a society obsessed with hierarchy. Bloodlines mattered, complexion mattered, facial structure mattered, and Beethoven constantly violated the unspoken rules without apologizing. That's why his patrons complained about him. Not that he was bad, that he was insubordinate. He didn't know his place. Now here's the part they don't teach. In Beethoven's lifetime, Europe was actively purging visible black presence from its history. The Moors had already been expelled from Spain. African saints were being repainted. Black nobles were quietly erased from portraits, and racial science was emerging to justify colonial dominance. Europe wasn't just conquering land, it was cleaning its mirrors, and Beethoven existed right in the middle of that transition. That's why early descriptions of him are raw and unfiltered, dark, rough, unpolished, un-European in demeanor. But later descriptions soften, refine, recast. The language shifts from physical reality to abstract genius. That shift is intentional. Once whiteness became the default setting for greatness, Beethoven's image had to be adjusted to survive inside the myth. So how did they do it? Slowly. They didn't announce it. They curated it. Portraits were repainted. Busts were idealized. Skin tones were lightened. Features narrowed. Hair softened. You don't erase someone by deleting them. You erase them by improving them, making them presentable. Now think about this. If Beethoven had been universally seen as unquestionably white during his life, why would later generations need to visually standardize him? They wouldn't. You don't correct what's already aligned. The correction tells you there was discomfort, and that discomfort shows up everywhere once you know where to look. Music historians often describe Beethoven as primitive but powerful, emotional, explosive, untamed. These are coded words, not musical critiques, racial ones. The same language used to describe African art, African rhythm, African expression. Uncontrolled brilliance. Sound familiar? Europe loved Beethoven's work but feared what he represented because his music broke rules. It bent structure. It refused neat containment. He didn't compose to flatter courts. He composed to confront humanity. That's not accidental style. That's cultural inheritance, and it made Europe uneasy. Because if the pinnacle of Western music carried African-coded traits, then Western superiority wasn't as clean as advertised. Now let's talk about silence. Notice how aggressively mainstream education avoids discussing Beethoven's appearance at all. They'll analyze tempo, harmony, deafness, drama, but not the body, not the man, not the social friction he caused. Silence is strategy. If you never describe him, you never have to explain him. And that's why questioning Beethoven's racial identity triggers emotional overreaction instead of calm debate. The narrative isn't fragile because it's false. It's fragile because it props up too much. Remove Beethoven from the whiteness pedestal, and suddenly Mozart isn't isolated genius. Bach isn't pure lineage. Classical music isn't a closed European miracle. It becomes a continuum, influenced by centuries of African presence in Europe, and that opens doors they don't want open. Here's another detail they skip. Beethoven was often mistaken for a servant when traveling, not once, repeatedly. He was treated as out of place in elite environments even when his name was known. That doesn't happen to celebrated white elites in 18th century Europe. It happens to people whose bodies disrupt expectation. And yet, when the music started, all resistance vanished. They couldn't deny the sound, so they controlled the story. That's the trick. You don't argue with greatness, you redefine it. By the mid-1800s, Beethoven was no longer a man. He was an idea, a statue, a symbol of European destiny. And symbols don't get messy ancestry, they get polish. This is why questioning Beethoven's image feels forbidden. Not because it's absurd, but because it threatens a carefully built cultural scaffold. If Beethoven wasn't what they said he was, then how many other figures were quietly edited? How many European achievements were actually multicultural? How many African-descended minds were absorbed, scrubbed, and relabeled? That's the real fear. Because once you accept that Beethoven's identity was curated, you have to revisit everything: art, philosophy, science, religion. And in the next chunk, we're going to move from motive to method. We're going to break down how historical whitening actually works, step by step, using Beethoven as the blueprint. Once you see the machinery, you'll recognize it everywhere. So ask yourself this: if Beethoven's face had to be edited to protect a myth, whose faces are still lying to you today? Let's expose the machine. Because once you understand how history edits people, Beethoven stops being an exception and starts being a case study. Whitening doesn't happen with one lie. It happens through layers. First layer, time. Beethoven dies. No voice, no rebuttal. That's when revision begins. Biographies written decades later suddenly become authoritative, even though they never met him. These writers weren't eyewitnesses. They were curators. And curators don't report. They select. What do they select? What fits the story they need? Second layer, art control. The portraits most people recognize today weren't the ones closest to Beethoven's life. They were produced later, when Europe had already hardened its racial boundaries. Artists weren't instructed to lie. They were instructed to idealize. And idealization has a look: lighter skin, sharper nose, thinner lips, calmer expression. You turn a living man into a marble concept. This is critical. When you compare early sketches and death masks to later paintings, the differences aren't subtle. They're directional, always toward whiteness, always toward refinement, always toward civilization. That direction tells you intent. Third layer, language manipulation. Early descriptions talk about Beethoven's physicality. Later writings talk about his inner turmoil, stormy temperament, and savage emotional force. Notice what disappears: the body. Because bodies complicate myths. Once you remove the body, you can insert whatever image you want. Fourth layer, academic gatekeeping. By the late 19th century, universities took ownership of Beethoven's legacy. And universities don't ask disruptive questions. They protect consensus, especially when that consensus props up racial hierarchy. So alternative interpretations get labeled fringe, speculative, offensive, not because they lack evidence, but because they destabilize authority. The message is clear: admire, don't analyze. Now here's the part that hits harder. Beethoven wasn't the only one. Europe did this repeatedly. Black saints repainted white. African philosophers rebranded Greek. Moorish scholars absorbed into European Renaissance. Same method, same playbook. So when people say, why would they lie about Beethoven? The answer is simple. Because they already had. They were already invested. And Beethoven was too powerful to leave untouched. Now let's talk about race science. In the 1800s, Europe began categorizing humanity like inventory, measurements, skulls, charts, hierarchies. Genius was being tied to biology, and whiteness was being crowned the source of progress. Beethoven, the crown jewel of Western music, couldn't disrupt that framework, so instead of adjusting the theory, they adjusted the man. This is where things get uncomfortable. Once whiteness became synonymous with intelligence, any evidence to the contrary had to be neutralized, and African excellence inside Europe was the most dangerous contradiction. You can conquer land, you can silence voices, but genius leaves receipts, so you claim it, you absorb it, you whiten it. That's not theft, that's laundering, and laundering works best when it looks clean. Now let's address the knee-jerk reaction. People say, but Beethoven was German. So what? Germany wasn't racially sealed. Europe wasn't racially sealed. That idea is retroactive fantasy. Africans had been in Europe for centuries before Beethoven, as soldiers, scholars, nobles, artists. Entire communities existed, especially in port cities and trade regions, and Beethoven's family roots sit right in the middle of those corridors. That doesn't make him African by passport. It makes him African by presence. And presence doesn't disappear just because later generations feel uncomfortable. Here's another point they avoid. If Beethoven were unmistakably white, there would be no debate, no controversy, no defensive outrage. People don't panic when facts align with myth. They panic when myths crack, and that's exactly what happens every time this conversation comes up. Not curiosity, not evidence-based rebuttal. Anger. That's emotional ownership talking. Because Beethoven isn't just a composer, he's a pillar, a proof point, a cornerstone of European identity, and pillars can't wobble, so the system reacts, dismiss, mock, silence. But none of that addresses the evidence, and evidence doesn't need permission. Now ask yourself something deeper. Why does it feel empowering for Black audiences to hear this possibility and threatening for others to hear it? Because identity has always been tied to achievement. Who gets credit decides who gets confidence. And for centuries, Black contributions were buried not because they were small, but because they were too big to ignore. Beethoven sits at that intersection. Too great to erase, too inconvenient to accept fully. So they did what empires always do. They kept the gold, changed the label. In the next chunk, we're going to zoom in even tighter. We're going to examine the physical evidence people avoid discussing. Death masks, contemporary sketches, first-hand accounts. The things that can't be debated away with opinion, because once you see the body they try to erase, the myth doesn't survive. And once the myth collapses, the question becomes unavoidable. If Beethoven's identity was curated, how many other European geniuses were never actually European at all? Let's deal with the part they dodged the hardest, the body. Because ideas can be debated, music can be abstracted, but bodies leave evidence, and Beethoven left one behind. When Beethoven died in 1827, a death mask was taken. Not a painting, not an interpretation, a direct cast of his face. No idealization, no polish, just bone, structure, and reality. And that mask doesn't match the familiar classroom portrait. The facial proportions are heavier, the nose is wider, the lips are fuller, the jaw is strong and pronounced, the brow is dense. This is not the refined, narrow-featured figure people imagine when they hear German composer. This is a man whose features disrupted European expectations. That's why later reproductions subtly adjusted them. You don't need conspiracy to explain this. You need incentive. Now let's talk eyewitnesses. People who interacted with Beethoven consistently described him as dark complexioned, rough-looking, and physically intense, not frail, not delicate, not porcelain. They commented on his skin tone repeatedly. Ask yourself why. People don't comment on what's normal. They comment on what stands out. In a society obsessed with appearance, Beethoven stood out, and not in a flattering way. According to European standards of the time, he was called unkempt, wild, foreign-looking. These aren't neutral words. These are social markers, and they align perfectly with how Europe described people it categorized as other. Now here's where the avoidance gets loud. Modern biographies rarely quote these descriptions directly. They paraphrase, soften, or skip them entirely. Why? Because first-hand accounts don't cooperate with the myth, and myths need cooperation. Let's address the portraits again, but properly. Beethoven sat for multiple artists during his lifetime. Early sketches show a man with darker shading and heavier features. Later paintings, especially those reproduced in textbooks, smooth him out. This isn't artistic evolution, it's ideological alignment, because by the time Beethoven became a national icon, Europe had decided what genius was supposed to look like, and he didn't look like it, so they fixed it. Now let's talk hair. Beethoven's hair was often described as thick, coarse, and unruly. Not soft curls, not powdered elegance, thick, dense, difficult to manage. Again, people don't describe hair unless it challenges expectation. European elites valued controlled appearance. Beethoven's physical presence resisted that. It mirrored his music, uncontained, forceful, unapologetic. That parallel isn't coincidence. Now here's a detail that rarely gets mentioned. Beethoven was deeply sensitive about his appearance. He knew he didn't fit the ideal. He expressed discomfort in social settings. He withdrew. He clashed. Not because he lacked confidence in his talent, but because his body was constantly being read before his work was heard. That's a familiar experience for people whose brilliance exists inside bodies others have already judged. And yet, once the music began, none of that mattered. The sound forced respect. So again, Europe faced a dilemma. Accept the full man and destabilize racial hierarchy, or preserve hierarchy and reframe the man. They chose the latter. Now let's dismantle a common deflection. People say, you're projecting modern racial categories backward. No, Europe did that first. Europe invented modern racial categories and retroactively applied them to history, not the other way around. The whitening of Beethoven wasn't correcting history. It was enforcing a new ideology onto the past. That ideology needed ancestors. White supremacy doesn't just need power, it needs lineage. It needs proof that greatness has always belonged to one group. Beethoven was perfect for that role, except his body didn't cooperate, so it was edited. And once edited, the new version was mass-produced. Textbooks, statues, currency, concert halls. The original complexity was flattened into a single, sanitized face. That face became truth through repetition. Now here's the uncomfortable pivot. If Beethoven's physical reality contradicts the icon, then the icon isn't history. It's branding. And branding doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about control. Control of narrative, control of prestige, control of who gets to claim genius as inheritance. That's why this conversation always gets shut down with ridicule instead of evidence, because ridicule is cheaper than explanation, and explanation risks exposure. In the next chunk, we're going to zoom out. We're going to place Beethoven inside a broader pattern of African presence in European classical culture, not as an anomaly, but as a continuation. Because once you see how common this actually was, the idea that Beethoven could be anything other than fully European starts to feel predictable. And once predictability sets in, denial collapses. So ask yourself this: if the body doesn't match the brand, which one do you trust? Now let's widen the frame, because Beethoven doesn't exist in isolation. He sits inside a crowded room Europe pretends was empty. Black presence in European classical culture wasn't rare, it was inconvenient. African and Afro-descended musicians, composers, and performers were embedded in Europe centuries before Beethoven. Court orchestras, royal ensembles, church choirs, military bands. This wasn't novelty. It was infrastructure. But history only remembers what it wants to claim. Take Chevalier de Saint-Georges, a black composer, virtuoso violinist, conductor, and fencing master in 18th century France. He led Europe's top orchestra. He outperformed Mozart in public competitions. He moved through aristocratic circles with ease, and then he was minimized, not erased completely, just reduced, labeled exceptional, unusual, rare. That language isn't descriptive, it's defensive, because if black excellence in classical music is rare, Europe stays exceptional. But if it's present, then the myth cracks. Beethoven lived in this same ecosystem. He wasn't inventing music in a vacuum. He was absorbing influences, rhythms, emotional structures, and traditions that had already been shaped by African presence. And this is where things get uncomfortable for purists. Classical music didn't rise from pure European soil. It grew from cross-cultural exchange, Moorish theory, African rhythm, Middle Eastern mathematics, Mediterranean blending. Europe didn't birth classical music alone. It curated it. And Beethoven's work reflects that hybridity. Listen to the aggression, the syncopation, the emotional volatility. This isn't polite court music. This is confrontational. Beethoven didn't write music to decorate rooms. He wrote music that challenged power, music that demanded attention, music that broke form. That tradition doesn't come from obedience. It comes from struggle. Now let's talk about the term Moor again, but properly. Moor wasn't a costume. It wasn't a nickname for fun. It was a racial and cultural identifier used across Europe for centuries. Moors ruled parts of Europe longer than many European kingdoms existed. They built universities, preserved science, developed music theory, and when Europe reclaimed political control, it tried to erase the memory while keeping the benefits. That erasure didn't remove people overnight. It blurred them. So by Beethoven's time, Moorish descendants were still present, but increasingly pushed to the margins of identity, allowed to contribute, discouraged from being remembered accurately. That's the environment Beethoven navigated. Not black in the modern American sense, but not white in the mythological European sense either. He existed in the in-between. And societies hate the in-between because it exposes the lie of purity. Now let's hit another avoided truth. Europe doesn't like acknowledging African influence in high culture because it destabilizes the hierarchy between folk and refined. African music gets labeled instinctual, emotional, primitive. European music gets labeled intellectual, structured, advanced. Beethoven shatters that binary. His music is raw and complex, emotional and mathematical, wild and disciplined. That synthesis isn't European purity, it's cultural fusion. And fusion terrifies systems built on separation. So instead of rethinking the system, they isolate the genius and pretend it emerged spontaneously. They turn Beethoven into a miracle. Miracles don't need ancestors. Now ask yourself this: why do textbooks rarely contextualize Beethoven alongside other black or Afro-descended European figures? Because context reveals patterns, and patterns expose systems. If Beethoven is alone, he's safe. If he's part of a continuum, the story changes. That's why Saint George is a footnote. That's why African musicians in European courts are treated as curiosities. That's why Moorish contributions are framed as influences instead of foundations. Language controls ownership, and ownership controls identity. Beethoven's identity had to be simplified to protect the story Europe wanted to tell about itself. Not because he lacked complexity, but because he had too much of it. In the next chunk, we're going to confront the hardest pushback directly. The emotional resistance, the anger, the why does this matter crowd. Because the fight over Beethoven isn't really about him. It's about who gets to inherit genius and who's been told they never had any to begin with. And once you see that, the outrage makes perfect sense. So here's the question you can't dodge. If Europe's cultural greatness depends on erasing African presence, how great was it really? Now let's deal with the pushback head on, because the loudest response to this conversation is always the same. Why does it matter? That question sounds neutral. It isn't. It's a defense mechanism, because if it doesn't matter, then no one has to re-examine anything. No one has to feel uncomfortable. No one has to admit that history was curated to protect power, but it matters because identity follows achievement. Who we credit shapes who we believe is capable. And Beethoven sits at the top of a hierarchy that's been used for centuries to justify exclusion. Classical music isn't just music, it's a cultural gate. It's been framed as proof of refinement, intelligence, discipline, and superiority. And that framing has been used to position black people as outsiders to high culture. So if Beethoven, the crown jewel of that culture, doesn't fit the racial image people were taught, the gate collapses. That's why people get emotional, because this isn't academic, it's psychological. Now let's talk about reaction patterns. When new evidence challenges a harmless belief, people get curious. When it challenges identity, they get angry. Notice how often critics attack the motives instead of the evidence. You just want to claim everything. You're rewriting history. This is divisive. Those are emotional responses, not factual ones, because the facts are uncomfortable. Descriptions, masks, portrait shifts, context, none of that disappears just because it disrupts a comfort zone. Here's another thing they don't want addressed. Beethoven himself resisted being owned. He refused to be treated as a servant. He rejected aristocratic submission. He demanded to be addressed as an equal. That behavior wasn't just rebellious, it was socially shocking. And that shock wasn't just about class, it was about who was asserting equality. Europe could tolerate genius from below if it was obedient. Beethoven wasn't. And that posture mirrors the experience of African-descended people throughout history. Exceptional contribution paired with constant resistance to subjugation. Now think about the timing. Beethoven lived during revolutions, American, French, Haitian. Ideas of freedom, equality, and human dignity were circulating, and those ideas terrified empires built on hierarchy. Beethoven openly admired revolutionary principles. He dedicated works to ideals of liberation. He believed power should be confronted. That alignment wasn't random. People gravitate toward struggles that reflect their own tension with the world around them. Now here's the quiet part. Even if someone refuses to accept that Beethoven was black or Moorish, the effort to erase the possibility still tells the truth, because no one fights this hard to defend a settled fact. The resistance itself is evidence. If the idea were absurd, it would be laughed off. Instead, it's aggressively shut down. That tells you it hits something structural, and that structure is racial inheritance. Western culture doesn't just want Beethoven's music. It wants his body as proof. Proof that genius looks a certain way. Proof that excellence belongs to a lineage. That's why alternative readings are treated as threats, not hypotheses. Now let's flip the lens. What happens when black audiences encounter this information? Not arrogance, not entitlement, recognition. Because this isn't about claiming Beethoven like a trophy, it's about breaking the Dabelada psychological spell that says blackness and brilliance are opposites. When that spell breaks, something shifts. Confidence, curiosity, ownership of history. That's dangerous to systems built on inherited doubt. Now here's the line that needs to be said plainly. Even if Beethoven was genetically mixed, culturally blended, or ambiguous, the refusal to allow that ambiguity is the problem. History isn't threatened by complexity. Power is. Because complexity dismantles purity myths. And purity myths are the backbone of supremacy. This conversation isn't asking people to replace one lie with another. It's asking them to stop pretending the lie was ever clean. Beethoven doesn't need to be black to expose the fraud. The fraud is exposed by how badly people need him not to be. That's the tell. In the next chunk, we're going to push this all the way forward. We're going to examine how modern media, education, and pop culture still protect this image, and how repetition has turned a curated portrait into unquestioned truth. Because once you understand how the myth survives today, you'll realize this isn't about the past. It's about control right now. So here's the question that matters. If the image of Beethoven was engineered to protect power, what other images are you still trusting without question? Let's bring this into the present. Because the myth doesn't survive on its own. It's maintained. Every textbook, every museum bust, every streaming platform thumbnail. The Beethoven you see today is not accidental. He's the result of repetition, and repetition is the strongest form of persuasion. Say something once, it's an idea. Say it 1,000 times, it's truth. That's how the image holds. Modern education doesn't teach Beethoven, it brands him. Clean, controlled, predictable. The same face everywhere, same posture, same expression, same tone. That consistency is not history, it's marketing. Because marketing isn't about accuracy, it's about familiarity. Once familiarity sets in, questioning feels offensive. That's why people react emotionally when the image is challenged. You're not disputing a fact to them. You're threatening something they've grown up trusting. Now look at how Beethoven is introduced. Not as a man shaped by environment, race, politics, or tension, but as a floating genius, disconnected from body, disconnected from ancestry, disconnected from struggle. That's intentional, because when you detach genius from context, you can assign it to whoever you want, and Europe assigned it to itself. This is the same process used across history. Jesus without ethnicity, pharaohs without Africa, saints without melanin. You remove context, then replace it with comfort. Beethoven's image fits perfectly into that system. Now here's something subtle, but critical. Notice how black people are welcomed into classical music spaces today, but rarely positioned as originators. Performers? Yes. Students? Yes. Audience members? Sure. But founders? Architects? Embodiments of the tradition? No. That boundary exists because the origin story must remain racially clean. Beethoven is the lock on that door. Because if the pinnacle figure becomes racially complex, the entire structure becomes unstable, so the system doubles down. Curated documentaries, sanitized biographies, selective scholarship. And most people don't notice because the presentation feels neutral, but neutrality is the most effective disguise. Now let's talk media. Film and television rarely challenge this narrative. When Beethoven appears, he's always portrayed the same way, pale, refined, almost saint-like. His roughness is emotional, not physical. That's not casting oversight, that's alignment. Because visual media reinforces what education seeds. Together, they form belief. Now here's the uncomfortable realization. Many people defending the image aren't defending Beethoven. They're defending what Beethoven represents to them. A reassurance that European culture was self-made, that excellence was isolated, that superiority was earned, not borrowed. That's why the idea feels threatening. It doesn't attack music, it attacks myth. And myth is emotional currency. Now flip it again. Why does this conversation energize black audiences? Because it reframes possibility. Not by handing out trophies, but by restoring realism. Africa and its descendants were not peripheral to global development, they were central. And every time that centrality is acknowledged, it cracks the narrative that black brilliance is modern, rare, or borrowed. Beethoven becomes symbolic because he sits at the peak. If the peak isn't racially pure, then the slope beneath it isn't either. Now here's the final pressure point. Even if tomorrow definitive proof surfaced that Beethoven was genetically European by modern standards, the process used to protect his image would still be exposed. And that process is the real story, because it reveals how history chooses faces, not based on truth, based on utility. Who does this image serve? Who gains confidence from it? Who loses confidence because of it? Those are the real questions. And once you start asking them, history stops being a timeline and starts being a battlefield. In the final chunk, we're going to land this, not with speculation, not with outrage, but with clarity. We're going to answer what this conversation is actually asking of you as the viewer, because the point isn't to argue about Beethoven forever. The point is to recognize how easily truth can be edited and how dangerous it is to outsource your understanding of history to images you never question. So here's the cliffhanger you should sit with. If the most recognizable face in Western music history was curated to protect power, what chance do lesser-known truths have if you don't go looking for them? So let's end this where it actually lands, not on Beethoven's skin, but on your mind. Because the real question was never, Was Beethoven black? The real question is, why were you trained to reject the possibility without investigation? That's the tell. History doesn't condition people to defend truth. It conditions people to defend order. And order depends on stories staying intact. Beethoven's image is one of those load-bearing stories. It props up an entire worldview where Europe is the origin of refinement, intelligence, and cultural depth, where genius flows in one direction, where everyone else is late, inspired, or secondary. Once that worldview cracks, everything else has to be reevaluated. That's why the reaction is emotional, not because the claim is outrageous, but because the implication is destabilizing. If Beethoven doesn't fit the image, then the image isn't natural. It's constructed, and if it's constructed, it can be dismantled. Now understand this clearly. No one needs Beethoven to be black to validate black brilliance. Africa's legacy stands without permission, but exposing how fiercely this idea is resisted reveals something deeper. How much cultural power depends on erasure. That's the lesson. History didn't just forget certain truths, it selected against them. And selection is not neutral. When textbooks repeat the same face, the same narrative, the same silence, generation after generation, that's not coincidence. That's maintenance. Maintenance of hierarchy. Maintenance of confidence for some. Maintenance of doubt for others. That's why this conversation matters. Not because it rewrites music history, but because it rewires psychology. When you realize that even the most settled figures were curated, you stop treating history as gospel and start treating it as evidence. You stop asking, what did they tell me? And start asking, why did they need me to believe that? That shift is dangerous to any system built on inherited authority. Now here's the final truth they don't want you sitting with. The biggest theft in history wasn't land. It wasn't labor. It wasn't even culture. It was self-doubt. Because once a people doubt their place in the past, they hesitate to claim the future. That's why images matter. That's why faces matter. That's why Beethoven matters. Not as property, but as proof of method. Proof that brilliance gets absorbed, relabeled, and protected when it threatens a narrative. Proof that history isn't just written by winners, it's edited by them. And once you see the edits, you can't unsee them. You start noticing how often Africa appears at the foundation and disappears in the retelling. You start noticing how many European miracles sit on borrowed shoulders. You start noticing how aggressively complexity is resisted. That awareness doesn't make you angry, it makes you free. Because free people don't need permission to investigate. They don't panic when myths crack, they follow the evidence. So take this with you. Don't memorize a conclusion, adopt a posture, question images, question silences, question who benefits from certainty. Because the truth doesn't need protection, only narratives do. And if the story of Beethoven had to be guarded this hard, curated this carefully, and defended this emotionally, what does that tell you about the rest of the history you never thought to question? Let's push this one step further, because this is where most people stop too early. They argue about Beethoven's race like it's a trivia question. That misses the point completely. The deeper issue is ownership of legacy. Who gets to decide what a figure represents once they're gone? Because Beethoven didn't control his legacy. Institutions did, and institutions don't preserve people, they preserve utility. Beethoven's utility wasn't just musical, it was symbolic. He became proof that Europe didn't just dominate the world with force, but with culture. That its greatness was internal, organic, inevitable. That's a powerful story. And powerful stories don't tolerate complications. So Beethoven was frozen into a role. His contradictions smoothed out. His physicality softened. His defiance reframed as temperament. His social friction rewritten as quirky genius. Anything that suggested struggle beyond class was erased, because class can be overcome. Race threatens the whole system. Now think about how often this happens. People don't just rewrite history by lying. They rewrite it by narrowing it. They take a full human being and compress them into a single trait that's easy to manage. Beethoven the genius. Not Beethoven the outsider. Not Beethoven the man navigating Europe's racial anxieties. not Beethoven the figure who didn't quite belong anywhere but still dominated everything. That version is dangerous because it's relatable to people history tells don't belong. Now here's the pivot that matters. When black audiences hear this story, the power isn't in claiming Beethoven. The power is in recognizing the pattern. The pattern says, whenever black presence reaches undeniable excellence, the response is absorption, dilution, and rebranding. Not rejection, ownership. That's more insidious because ownership convinces the world that greatness was always internal while quietly stripping the source of visibility. And once you see that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, in philosophy, in religion, in science, in art. The question stops being, was this person black, and becomes, why am I only seeing one version of this story? That's the awakening. Now let's deal with a subtle lie. People assume that reclaiming erased history is about replacing heroes. It's not. It's about restoring continuity. Black history didn't start in suffering. It didn't start in margins. It didn't start as reaction. It started as foundation. And when you understand that, Beethoven isn't an outlier. He's a signal flare, a reminder that black presence wasn't confined to what history later labeled black spaces. It was everywhere, integrated, influential, unavoidable, which is exactly why it had to be edited. Now here's something uncomfortable but honest. If Beethoven had lived 2 centuries later, this conversation wouldn't be controversial because photography would have removed the ambiguity, and that alone should tell you something. So much of what we know about the past survives only because images were interpretable, editable, and repeatable, and the people controlling those images had agendas. This isn't cynicism, it's literacy. Understanding how history functions doesn't make you anti-history. It makes you resistant to manipulation. And that's what this entire conversation trains you to be. Resistant, not to facts, but to packaging. Now bring this back to yourself. Every time you were told black excellence was new, rare, or borrowed, that was conditioning. Every time African influence was framed as peripheral, that was training. And every time you internalized doubt about belonging in spaces labeled high culture, that was the system working exactly as designed. Beethoven's story disrupts that design, not because it hands you ownership of classical music, but because it removes the illusion that you were ever excluded by nature. You were excluded by narrative, and narratives can be dismantled. Now here's the final setup before we close this chapter. Once you understand that Beethoven's image was curated to protect the story, you stop being impressed by surface-level authority. Degrees don't intimidate you. Institutions don't silence you. Consensus doesn't hypnotize you. Because consensus has been wrong before, deliberately. So the real inheritance here isn't Beethoven's music, it's permission. Permission to question what you were handed. Permission to investigate what was skipped. Permission to trust your curiosity over comfort. And that permission is dangerous to any system built on passive belief. In the final chunk, we're going to lock this in, not with another argument, but with a challenge. Because once you see how one story was curated, you can't unknow it. And the only question left is this: what are you going to do differently now that you know history isn't as neutral as it pretended to be? Here's the bottom line. No cushioning, no theatrics. History didn't misrepresent Beethoven by mistake. It managed him. And once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. The question was never, was Beethoven black? The real question is, why was it necessary to make sure he wasn't perceived that way? That's where the truth lives. Because power doesn't erase what's weak, it erases what competes. Beethoven competed with a narrative Europe was desperate to sell. That genius, refinement, and cultural authority were exclusive products of whiteness. And when someone doesn't fit that mold but dominates the field anyway, the system adapts. Not by arguing, by editing. This is how control works at the highest level. Quiet, polite, academic, respectable. No riots, no announcements, just consensus. Consensus is the most powerful weapon history has ever used. Once everyone agrees on an image, questioning it feels radical, dangerous, offensive, even when the question is reasonable. That's how myths become untouchable. Now sit with this. Beethoven didn't benefit from being mythologized. He was dead. The beneficiaries were institutions, conservatories, empires of culture, national identities that needed him as proof. Proof that greatness flowed from them. Proof that dominance was earned. Proof that hierarchy was natural. And once proof exists, it gets guarded. That's why debates around Beethoven's image don't stay intellectual. They turn emotional, because people don't want facts challenged. They want identity protected, and that's human. But truth doesn't care about comfort. Truth cares about patterns, and the pattern is clear. When African presence intersects with undeniable excellence, the response is not denial. It's absorption, followed by whitening. That pattern repeats too often to be coincidence. Now here's the part that matters most. This isn't about reclaiming one man. It's about reclaiming discernment. The ability to look at history and ask, who told this story? Who benefits from this version? What was left out? And why? That skill is liberation, because once you apply it to Beethoven, you start applying it everywhere. You question images of antiquity. You question sanitized saints. You question European miracles. You question timelines that begin where power wants them to begin. And suddenly, the world looks different. Not hostile, not rigged beyond repair, just edited. And edits can be reversed. That's why this matters for Black audiences especially. Not to inflate ego, not to steal icons, but to restore continuity. To understand that Black presence didn't enter history begging for permission. It was already there, shaping, building, influencing, long before it was told to forget itself. Beethoven becomes a mirror, not because he answers everything, but because he exposes method. Once you see how carefully his image was curated, you realize how much effort went into managing perception. And effort leaves fingerprints. So here's your challenge. Stop treating history as settled. Stop confusing repetition with truth. Stop outsourcing your understanding to institutions that benefit from your silence. You don't need to accept every claim. You don't need to agree with every interpretation, but you do need to stay curious, because curiosity is what systems fear most. Beethoven's music survived because it was undeniable. The question now is whether you'll let the truth survive the same way, even when it disrupts comfort, prestige, and tradition. So the last question isn't about him, it's about you. Now that you know history can be curated, edited, and protected, what else are you ready to question?